She claimed to recall every detail, yet one memory could cost her life. Welcome to Revenge Oath. I'm your moderator, Conan Doyle. Comment below. Where are you listening from today? Your thoughts bring each clue into sharper focus. Thank you for being part of this. It was on a particularly dreary afternoon in late November that I found myself once more in the familiar sitting room of 221B Baker Street, watching the rain perform its dull, rhythmic dance against the window panes. Holmes, curled like a cat in the corner of the settee, had been silent for the better part of an hour, a Persian slipper of tobacco in one hand and the Times spread open across his lap. His eyes, however, were unfocused, fixed not on the print, but on the deeper theatre of thought behind them. You observe the weather, I remarked, for lack of more compelling conversation. My dear Watson, Holmes murmured without looking up, the weather is seldom of any consequence unless it alters a man's habits or conceals his footprints. Before I could reply, the bell below rang with a sharp urgency, and a moment later the familiar tread of Mrs. Hudson approached. She did not knock before entering, a rare breach of her usual decorum. "I'm sorry, Mr. Holmes, but this lady insists she must speak with you at once," she said, breathless and clearly flustered. "Says it's a matter of life and death." Holmes looked up then, the veil of abstraction vanishing from his face. "Show her in, Mrs. Hudson." The woman who entered was not the sort of person one associated with hysteria. She was tall, perhaps in her early 30s, with auburn hair pinned precisely, a tailored grey dress of excellent but conservative cut, and eyes that shifted rapidly, scanning every corner of the room as though committing it to memory. She clutched a small, leather-bound notebook to her chest with both hands. "I'm Miss Clara Ridley," she said at once, her voice low and controlled. "Mr. Holmes, I believe someone is trying to kill me, but I cannot prove it. I remember things I should not." Holmes motioned for her to sit. "Let us take things from the beginning, Miss Ridley. What is it exactly that you remember?" She hesitated. "Everything." "Everything?" I asked, incredulous. "Since I was a child. Every conversation, every word on every page I've read, every face I've ever seen. And last night I recalled a detail that I believe was never meant to be remembered. A detail that someone would kill to keep buried." Holmes's eyes glittered with sudden interest. "You possess hyperthymesia?" She nodded. I did not know the term until recently. I'd long thought everyone remembered as I do, but it is not a blessing, Mr. Holmes. It is a curse, and now it may cost me my life. Holmes steepled his fingers. "And what precisely did you recall?" "A conversation I overheard 17 years ago," she said, voice steady. "In a country house in Gloucestershire. I was 12. The man whose voice I now recognize was speaking of a murder, one that was later ruled an accident. He said, 'She'll never know what she drank. The arsenic will pass for tonic.' And the victim, Lady Eugenia Crowthorne. The coroner said it was heart failure. I only remembered the words last night, clear as day, when I passed the man responsible in a restaurant. He is now Sir Felix Bradmore, a member of Parliament." At this, Holmes stood. "This is no ordinary memory, Watson. It is a living archive." "But why now?" I asked. "Why remember this after 17 years?" She looked at me with bleak certainty. "Because he recognized me, and I believe he means to silence me before I remember more." Holmes's fingers tapped rapidly on the arm of his chair. "A crime long buried," he said softly, "and a mind that buries nothing. Miss Ridley, you have brought us a singularly curious case." And with that, the game was afoot. Holmes remained still for a long moment, his sharp eyes fixed not on Miss Ridley, but on some far-off point in the room, as though seeing the scene in that Gloucestershire drawing-room 17 years ago unfold before him in the smoke of memory. Then, in a motion so fluid it seemed premeditated, He crossed to the mantel, struck a match, and lit his pipe. "You say you were 12 at the time, Miss Ridley," he said, his tone thoughtful but probing. "Why were you at Lady Crowthorne's estate?" "My father was a solicitor," she answered, still clasping her notebook to her chest. "He often travelled with me during the holidays when my governess was indisposed. On that particular week, he had been asked to review the late Lord Crowthorne's estate documents after his death. He brought me along as the house was considered safe, and Lady Eugenia insisted on hosting us in person. She was fond of my mother, I believe." Holmes nodded once. "And where, precisely, were you when you overheard this confession?" "In the music room. I had been reading on the window seat behind the velvet curtain. I had fallen asleep, or so I thought, but as I stirred, I heard voices in the adjoining study. The panel door between the two rooms had been left slightly ajar." "You did not see the speaker?" "Number, but now I'm sure of his voice. At the time it meant nothing. But last night, when I heard Sir Felix speaking to a waiter at the Reform Club, I felt a chill run through me. The cadence, the slight rasp at the end of his consonants, the way he uses 'indeed' as a verbal pause. It was the same voice." Holmes blew out a stream of smoke. "And what precisely did he say back then?" "He said, 'The arsenic will pass for tonic. She'll be dead by morning, and no one will think to question it.'" Then there was a laugh, low and mean. Another voice replied, but too softly for me to hear. Holmes turned to me. "Do you note, Watson, that we are dealing with two voices, not one? If Sir Felix, then merely Mr. Bradmore, was not alone, there is another who may know the truth or be complicit in the crime." Miss Ridley leaned forward. "I understand how implausible it sounds that a child heard something no one else did, that a member of Parliament could have committed a murder. But I am not mad, Mr. Holmes." "No," Holmes said quietly. "You are something far more dangerous to such men. You are accurate." He reached for his notebook, opened it, and scribbled quickly. "Watson, make a note. We must obtain a copy of Lady Eugenia's death certificate and the coroner's report. I imagine the inquest was a minor affair if the death was ruled natural." "And the location?" I asked. "Crowthorne House, near the village of Lidford Vale. I believe we shall pay them a visit. Miss Ridley, did your father mention anything unusual after the death?" She hesitated. "Only that Lady Eugenia had seemed in perfect health before dinner and collapsed hours later. He was shaken but not suspicious. No one was." "And the household? Who else was present?" "I recall a few names. A Dr. Horace Dillingham, who attended her after she fell ill. A young maid named Ivy, who helped dress the table. And of course, Mr. Bradmore, though he was introduced as a guest, an associate of Lady Eugenia's late husband." "Dillingham," Holmes repeated. "That will be our next point of inquiry. A country doctor rarely leaves his parish. If he still practices, he may provide useful context." Miss Ridley's hands trembled slightly as she lowered her notebook onto the table. "Mr. Holmes, forgive me, but do you believe I'm in danger?" Holmes looked at her gravely. "I believe you are in a position to make very powerful men nervous. That is often the most dangerous position of all. Has anything occurred since your recognition of Bradmore that suggests a threat?" She nodded. "Last night, after I left the club, I took a cab. I gave my address, but the driver took a wrong turn, down an alley near Seven Dials. I protested, and he said nothing, just pulled the horse to a stop. I jumped out and ran. When I turned, the cab was gone." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "A bold attempt, not a simple robbery, then." I stood. "We must inform the police, Holmes. Lestrade—" "No, Watson. Not yet. The Yard is adept at locking a stable once the horse has fled. Sir Felix is no ordinary criminal. He will cover his tracks in Parliament as swiftly as he did in Gloucestershire. No, we must first collect evidence, then we strike." Miss Ridley looked both relieved and pale. "I can stay with my cousin in Hampstead," she offered. I haven't told her the full reason, but she would take me in at once. "Do so," Holmes agreed, and avoid public places. If you must write anything down, write only what you would not regret being read aloud in court. That memory of yours is your greatest weapon, but it is also a burden others may wish to relieve you of by violent means. After she left, Holmes turned to me. She is quite remarkable, Watson, not just for what she remembers, but for what she does not yet understand. A man like Bradmore would never allow a threat like her to walk unshadowed. There's more to this than a buried murder. You believe she is being watched? I would wager it, in coin or blood. He paused. Pack for an early train tomorrow. We go to Lidford Vale. I wish to stand in the music room of Crowthorne House, to look behind the curtain as she did, and consider what the child saw, and what the men beyond the door never imagined might be heard. As I gathered my notebook, I could not help but feel a stirring of excitement. Though I had grown accustomed to Holmes's dramatic pronouncements, there was something in his voice, low, deliberate, that told me this case would demand not only his intellect, but our utmost caution. And somewhere in the fog of memory and murder, a woman's perfect recollection might be the thread that unraveled a political legacy built upon poison and silence. The following morning dawned grey and wet, the clouds hanging low over London like a curtain unwilling to lift. Holmes was already up and dressed when I descended the stairs to our sitting room. He stood by the fire, slipping a bundle of correspondence into the inner pocket of his coat. We are to catch the 8:12 train to Gloucestershire, he said without preamble. I've telegraphed the local parish registry for a copy of Lady Eugenia's death certificate. With luck, it will be at the post office in Lidford Vale when we arrive. And Miss Ridley? I asked as I pulled on my gloves. She is secure for now, Holmes replied. I had a note from her this morning. Her cousin's house is quiet, and she intends to remain indoors, as instructed. Nevertheless, I've asked Wiggins to station one of his Baker Street irregulars near the property, just in case our friend Sir Felix grows impatient. We departed Baker Street under umbrellas, Holmes walking at a brisk pace despite the drizzle. During the train ride, he was unusually quiet, his eyes fixed on the rain-streaked window, his fingers absently tracing circles in the condensation. I knew better than to interrupt when he was deep in thought. Only once did he speak. Watson, have you ever considered the unreliability of death? I turned to him, puzzled. I'm not sure I follow. In most cases, Holmes said, still looking out the window, death is the one certainty. Yet it is also, paradoxically, the easiest condition to falsify. A clever man with access to the body and the right compound could persuade even a seasoned physician to sign away a murder as misadventure. You mean Dr. Dillingham may have been complicit? Holmes shook his head. Too early to tell. He may have been duped, or he may have been chosen precisely because he was credulous. We shall see. By mid-afternoon, we arrived in Lidford Vale, a sleepy village nestled among rolling hills and flanked by fog-cloaked woodlands. The air was thick with the scent of peat and smoke. A boy from the station carried our bags to the local inn, and Holmes wasted no time in visiting the post office. Success, he murmured, producing a folded sheet from the envelope handed to him. We stepped under the cover of the awning while he studied it. Cause of death listed as acute cardiac failure, he said. Attending physician, Horace Dillingham. Time of death, approximately 2:15 a.m. Body cremated 2 days later at the family's request. No autopsy performed. No autopsy? I repeated, incredulous. The Crowthorne name carries weight. Lady Eugenia was admired by the local gentry, and her husband's passing only a year prior likely contributed to the assumption of natural causes. No suspicion, no inquiry. And the timing matches Miss Ridley's account? Precisely. She said she overheard the remark about the tonic during the evening. Death occurred hours later. Holmes folded the document and tucked it away. We shall now call upon Dr. Dillingham. I find myself curious about the man who declared a perfectly healthy woman dead of nothing more than poor luck. The doctor's surgery was a modest stone building near the village green. Inside, the air smelled faintly of carbolic and faded camphor. Dr. Horace Dillingham was a wiry man in his 60s, his hair thinning, his coat somewhat frayed, but his eyes sharp with the habit of clinical observation. He welcomed us politely, if cautiously, when Holmes introduced himself. "You'll forgive me," Dillingham said, motioning us to sit, "but I was under the impression that Lady Eugenia's death had long since been put to rest." "We are not here to disturb her memory, Doctor," Holmes said gently. "We are here to test it." The old man frowned. "What do you mean?" Holmes drew the death certificate from his coat and placed it on the table. "Do you recall the circumstances of her death?" Dillingham nodded. "Very well. She collapsed in the drawing room shortly after midnight. Convulsions, shortness of breath, cyanosis, textbook signs of cardiac arrest. She had no documented history of heart trouble, but these things do not always provide notice." "Was she attended beforehand by any other medical professional?" "No, none. I'd been her family's doctor since her marriage to Lord Crowthorne." "And was anything unusual in her appearance, her behavior?" Dillingham hesitated, the lines in his brow deepening. "Well," he said slowly, "there was something odd. Her lips were unusually discolored, more than I'd expect even with cyanosis. And the smell, there was a faint bitterness on her breath." "Bitterness?" "Yes, like almonds, though I dismissed it. The room was filled with perfumes, and I presumed it to be something she had drunk earlier, perhaps a liqueur." Holmes and I exchanged a look. I knew what he was thinking, and it made my skin prickle. "Doctor," Holmes said carefully, "did you test for poisoning?" "No," Dillingham admitted. "There was no precedent. She was well loved, had no known enemies, and no suspicion of foul play. To suggest as much without evidence would have been, well, scandalous." Holmes nodded, rising from his seat. "You may have done precisely what you were expected to do, Doctor. Good day to you." We stepped outside into the drizzle once more. "Almonds," I muttered. "Cyanide," Holmes nodded grimly, "or arsenic. Both can present similar symptoms, though arsenic is slower, subtler. It would match the quote Miss Ridley remembered, 'The arsenic will pass for tonic.' The bitterness on the breath is a crucial detail. The fact Dillingham remembers it after all these years suggests it troubled him, even unconsciously." As we walked back through the village, Holmes veered suddenly off the main road. "Where are we going?" I asked. "To Crowthorne House." We followed a narrow lane flanked by hedgerows until the manor came into view. Time had not been kind to it. Though still grand, the estate bore the look of slow decay. Ivy crawling up crumbling stone, windows shuttered or cracked, the garden left untended. We approached the gate, and Holmes tested it. It creaked open with effort. "I believe," he said, "that no one has lived here in some years." He led the way up the gravel drive, pausing only to study the tracks. What little could be discerned in the muddy earth. "2 sets of prints," he murmured. "One quite fresh." "Could it be caretakers?" I offered. "Or someone else with an interest in secrets best left buried?" Holmes tried the front door. It gave after a moment's resistance. Inside, the air was heavy with disuse and rot. We lit our lanterns and moved cautiously. Holmes led me to the music room. Panelled walls, a mouldering pianoforte in one corner, a tattered curtain beside a broad window seat. Holmes examined the floor, the hinges of the adjoining panel door. He knelt and brushed dust from the carpet. "Observe, Watson, the imprint of a small book, here, just beside the curtain. A child's book, perhaps." He moved to the panel door and gently pushed. It swung open onto a study. "Imagine the child curled behind the curtain," Holmes murmured, as 2 men spoke in this study. "Imagine the voices, the words, the arrogance of men who believe their sins too distant in time ever to catch up with them." He straightened. And yet they did not reckon with memory. As we stood there, a soft creak echoed through the house. Holmes froze. I reached instinctively into my coat. Another creak, closer now. Footsteps. Holmes signaled me silently, drawing his revolver from his inner pocket. He stepped lightly through the study, motioning me to follow. But as we turned the corner into the hall, the footsteps ceased, only silence. Then a faint scraping, the back door. We hurried to it, throwing it open, just in time to see a dark figure vanishing into the trees. Holmes lowered his weapon, frowning. "He's watching the house," he said softly. "We are not the only ones retracing the past." And so the shadows of Crowthorne House grew longer, as our footsteps echoed through rooms where secrets once whispered now threatened to speak aloud. Holmes did not speak for a full minute after the figure vanished into the mist-shrouded woods. He remained on the threshold, eyes narrowed, one hand still resting loosely on the revolver at his side. I watched him closely, noting the tightening of his jaw, the sort of stillness he assumed when thought raced faster than words could follow. "He was listening," Holmes murmured at last. "You believe he heard us in the music room?" "Almost certainly. He followed us here, waited until we were inside, and then crept in through the rear. He hoped to learn how much we knew, or perhaps what we were looking for. When he heard enough, he fled." "Do you suppose it was Bradmore?" Holmes stepped back into the study, holstering his weapon. "Possibly, but a man of his stature would be a fool to expose himself so directly, especially in such a decayed, local setting. No, Watson, more likely an agent, a loyal servant. Someone paid to monitor any disturbance to a very carefully buried secret." He walked briskly back into the music room and began examining the corners with renewed focus, his lantern casting flickering shadows over the faded floral wallpaper. "Watson, consider, if Bradmore murdered Lady Eugenia and orchestrated a false narrative, he would have needed more than poison. He would have needed someone to tamper with the tonic, someone to deliver it without suspicion, and someone to ensure the evidence was never questioned." "A servant," I said. "Precisely. Or several. Now, what would a terrified servant do if, years later, guilt or fear overtook them? Hide the truth somewhere safe, I ventured. Or attempt to confess, perhaps incompletely, out of fear, and hide the rest." Holmes moved to the fireplace and examined the wooden panels above it. "This house has stood silent for nearly 2 decades, but people leave traces, Watson, even when they try not to." He ran his fingers along the top edge of the mantelpiece and stopped. "Ah." He produced a thin knife from his coat and pried at a sliver in the wood. With a faint pop, a section of the paneling gave way to reveal a shallow recess. Inside was a yellowed envelope sealed with wax, the seal itself cracked and brittle with age. Holmes removed it delicately and handed it to me. It was addressed in a fine, nervous script. "To be given to Mr. Frederick Ridley, solicitor, should harm befall Lady Crowthorne." "Miss Ridley's father," I said aloud. Holmes gave a satisfied nod. "Then it seems someone was prepared to speak, but did not survive the attempt." He opened the envelope with care. Inside was a single sheet, folded twice, the ink faded but still legible. Holmes held it to the lantern's light and began reading aloud. "I do this with fear in my heart, for what I saw cannot be ignored. Mr. Bradmore placed something in her ladyship's tonic just before dinner. I did not speak because he threatened Ivy. Said he knew where her family lived. Said he would ruin us all. I feared too much. But if anything happens to her ladyship, please tell Mr. Ridley the truth. I know what I saw. Annabel Clark, maidservant." Holmes folded the letter and exhaled slowly. "There's our witness, Watson, and motive for silence. Do you think she's still alive?" "I doubt it. This note was never delivered. Either she lost her nerve or someone found her before she could act. But this may be enough to tear the veil away." He slipped the letter into his pocket. "Let us return to the inn. I need to wire Miss Ridley. She must be told, quietly. And then, Watson, we must turn our attention to the girl named Ivy." Back in the inn's private parlor, warmed by a hissing fire, Holmes composed a short message to Miss Ridley. "Received confirmation of your account. One who witnessed the tampering left a record. Remain indoors. Await further instructions. S.R." He handed it to the innkeeper with a firm request for secure transmission. I poured us each a glass of brandy. Holmes accepted his with a faint nod and sipped thoughtfully. "Ivy," he said, "would have been young, likely between 15 and 20 at the time. That would place her in her early 30s now. Perhaps married, perhaps not. But Lidford Vale is small. If she remained in the area, the villagers will know. You think she may speak? If she lives, and if fear no longer rules her tongue, her silence may have been coerced. But the world has changed, and with this letter we hold a lever strong enough to pry loose the truth." The following morning, Holmes and I set out again through the village. The fog had lifted somewhat, revealing narrow lanes and tidy rows of stone cottages, many of which seemed to have seen little change since the days of Lady Eugenia. Holmes called first at the parish records office. The elderly clerk, a stooped man with pince-nez and a poor grasp of filing, eventually located the Crowthorne household ledger. "Ivy Tomlin," Holmes read aloud. "Listed as kitchen maid in 1878. Father was a wheelwright. Lived on Chapel Lane. Look here. Married George Halsey, stableman, 1882. Moved to number 3, Low Common." We thanked the clerk and made our way down to Low Common, a row of simple but respectable cottages on the edge of the village. Number 3 had a neat garden and smoke curling from the chimney. Holmes knocked, and after a pause, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and greying hair answered. "Mrs. Halsey?" Holmes inquired politely. "Yes?" "My name is Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. May we speak with you a moment? It concerns your former employment at Crowthorne House." At the mention of the estate, the woman's face grew guarded. She glanced past us, as though checking for others. "I haven't spoken of that place in years." "We understand," Holmes said gently. "But it may be that you are the last living witness to something very grave. We do not seek to expose you. We seek justice for a woman who was murdered." Her eyes widened. "You know, we believe Lady Eugenia was poisoned by Felix Bradmore, and we have a letter written by a fellow maid, Annabel Clark, who saw it happen. We also believe she was silenced before she could speak." Mrs. Halsey's shoulders slumped, and her hand trembled slightly as she motioned us inside. "I've carried it for years," she whispered. "Carried it like a stone round my neck." She sat across from us at a small kitchen table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "It was Annabel who came to me that night," she said. "She was terrified. She told me what she'd seen. Bradmore pouring something into Lady Eugenia's tonic. She wanted to go to the constable, but I begged her not to. Said it would ruin us both. I thought maybe it wasn't real. Maybe she was mistaken." Her voice broke. The next morning she was gone. They said she'd gone home to see her sick mother, but she never returned, and no one ever saw her again. "Did you tell anyone?" I asked. "I told George, my husband. He told me to bury it. Said we'd end up dead too." Holmes reached across the table and placed the letter before her. "Miss Ridley remembers everything, Mrs. Halsey. She heard Bradmore's voice when she was 12 and remembered his words last week. That memory has put her in danger. You, however, can protect her. You can speak." Tears welled in the woman's eyes. She nodded slowly. "Then I will. I'll tell the police. I'll sign what I must." Holmes gave a rare smile. "You're doing the right thing. And now, Mrs. Halsey, we must act quickly, because I do not think Bradmore will remain idle." As we rose to go, I could feel the air shift. The noose was tightening. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the silence surrounding Lady Eugenia Crowthorne's death was beginning to crack. And somewhere in the distance, I imagined Felix Bradmore, Sir Felix now, feeling that same crack echoing toward him. We returned to the inn in silence, the weight of Mrs. Halsey's confession hanging heavily between us. Holmes, though outwardly composed, radiated a subtle energy I'd come to recognize from past cases. It was the quiet tension of the chess player approaching checkmate. Yet even now, I knew he would not celebrate prematurely. The most dangerous move in Holmes's mind was always the penultimate one. Back in the parlor, Holmes sat by the window, fingers pressed together beneath his chin as he stared into the thickening fog outside. I poured him a fresh cup of tea, but he barely touched it. "We have 3 pieces now, Watson," he said eventually, without turning. "Miss Ridley's memory, Annabel Clark's letter, and Mrs. Halsey's testimony. Each corroborates the others. Independently, they are suggestive. Together, they are damning. You believe it's enough to bring Bradmore to justice?" "Not yet," Holmes replied. "We know the truth. But truth without proof is merely accusation, and a man like Bradmore will not fall to whispers. He will require a confession, preferably his own." "And how do you propose to obtain that?" Holmes turned at last. A faint gleam lit his eyes. "We bait the trap. We provoke his pride and his fear, both of which I believe to be vast and volatile. He has spent 17 years guarding his secret. He will not sit idle while it unravels before him." I frowned. "But he doesn't know how much we know, only that Miss Ridley remembers something." "Exactly," Holmes said. "We must make him believe that everything hinges upon her, and that she is preparing to speak. His instinct will be to silence her, but when he comes to do so, we will be waiting." I shifted uneasily. "You mean to use her as bait?" Holmes shook his head. "Not without her consent. I will send her a message tonight, asking her to return to London under the strictest protection. We will arrange a meeting in a controlled setting, one that will allow us to draw Bradmore out." He rose abruptly and crossed to the writing desk. "But first, we must act quickly. We have the foundation. Now we must lay the final stone." He wrote with his usual speed and economy of motion. The letter was brief but precise. When he finished, he folded and sealed it with wax, then handed it to me. "To be delivered by express to Miss Clara Ridley. We will return to London by nightfall tomorrow. And Watson, send a second note to Inspector Lestrade. Tell him we will require a discreet detachment, men he can trust to remain invisible until called for." "Are we preparing for an arrest?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "We are preparing for a reckoning." The train carried us back to London under a darkening sky, the city emerging through the mist like some vast mechanical beast, blinking with gaslight and bristling with noise. It was nearly 10 o'clock when we arrived at Baker Street. Wiggins was waiting outside the door, hands buried in the pockets of his ragged coat. "Evening, Mr. Holmes," he said. "That lady you asked me to watch is still at her cousin's in Hampstead. Quiet as a mouse." Holmes nodded. "No unusual visitors. One gentleman yesterday, tall, mustache, looked like a banker or a clerk. Asked the neighbor if Miss Ridley was at home. Said he was an old friend. Didn't leave a name. Thank you, Wiggins. Take 2 of your lads and keep the watch tonight. One at the front, one at the alley behind. No one in or out without my instruction." Wiggins tipped his cap and vanished into the dark. Inside, Holmes moved with purpose, his coat already off, his hands moving swiftly through maps, notes, and correspondences laid out across the sitting-room table. I knew better than to interrupt. At last, he looked up. The final meeting must occur in a place Bradmore cannot control, yet one where he will feel secure enough to speak freely. And where is that? "The Ridley home in Marylebone," Holmes replied. "Her late father's law office remains largely intact. A respectable location, familiar to her, and, crucially, It contains a false wall, installed during the war, which will suit our purposes perfectly." He paused. "Bradmore will come to her. Of that I am certain. He will either seek to bribe, frighten, or eliminate her. But his presence will be his undoing." The next evening, under a moonless sky, the stage was set. Miss Ridley had agreed to the meeting with quiet courage, her expression betraying neither fear nor doubt. She sat in the office's front parlor, dressed modestly, a cup of tea in her hands. Holmes, Lestrade, and I stood in the narrow anteroom behind the false wall, a hidden chamber originally intended for safeguarding valuables during the tumult of the previous generation. Through a thin slit in the panel, we could see and hear everything. "Holmes," Lestrade whispered beside me, "are you quite sure this fellow will come himself?" "He's too proud to delegate a final act," Holmes murmured, "and too afraid to trust anyone else." Watch the clock struck 8:30. Moments later, footsteps sounded in the corridor. A soft knock came at the door. Miss Ridley answered it. Sir Felix Bradmore entered like a man paying a courtesy call. He was tall, trim, and impeccably dressed, his coat immaculate, his gloves of kid leather, his expression one of carefully modulated concern. "Miss Ridley," he said smoothly, "may I come in?" "You already have, Sir Felix," she replied evenly. "Would you care to sit?" "Thank you." He took the armchair opposite hers and removed his gloves with precise, practiced motions. "I was most distressed to learn you had remembered something from your childhood." "Distressed and curious. You see, I too recall that summer at Crowthorne House, a happy time despite the unfortunate loss of Lady Eugenia." Miss Ridley said nothing. Bradmore leaned forward slightly, voice lowering. "May I speak plainly, Miss Ridley? I insist on it. You are in possession of a memory, a fragile thing, memory, easily misinterpreted, especially from the vantage of a child." Her eyes did not waver. "I remember what you said, Sir Felix, word for word." Bradmore's mask cracked, just a flicker. He smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "Then let us suppose," he said, softly, "that your recollection is entirely accurate. Suppose it were true. You must realize the consequences for everyone involved. My family, my position, the government itself. A scandal of this nature could destroy lives." "Including mine," she replied. He nodded solemnly. "Which is why I've come to offer you an alternative." He reached into his coat and produced a sealed envelope. "A fund, substantial, enough to ensure your comfort for the rest of your life. All I ask in return is your silence. Permanently." Holmes, beside me, tensed. Miss Ridley's voice was steady. "And if I refuse?" Bradmore's smile vanished. "Then I must do what necessity demands. For the greater good. You leave me no choice." He rose, and from his pocket came not another envelope, but a glint of steel. Holmes moved like a shot. The hidden panel burst open, and he was upon Bradmore in seconds, wrenching the blade from his hand and throwing him face first to the floor. Lestrade was already on him, cuffs in hand. "You're under arrest, Sir Felix Bradmore," the inspector said grimly, "for conspiracy, attempted murder, and the murder of Lady Eugenia Crowthorne." For a moment, Bradmore struggled, but the fight left him quickly. He looked up at Holmes, disbelief and fury etched into every line of his face. "You," he hissed. "I," Holmes replied, "prefer memory to money. And Miss Ridley remembers everything." As Bradmore was led out, Miss Ridley sat motionless, the teacup still cradled in her lap. Holmes turned to her, his tone softened. "It is finished." She looked at him with clear, tired eyes. "No, Mr. Holmes, but at least it has begun." And so it had. For justice, though often late, had finally remembered what the world tried to forget. The newspapers exploded the next morning. Every major London publication ran some version of the headline, "Member of Parliament arrested for cold case murder. Sir Felix Bradmore accused in 17-year-old death of aristocrat. Murder remembered, woman's memory triggers political scandal." Some speculated wildly about political motives or foreign intrigue. Others clung to the salacious details, poison, bribery, betrayal. But none possessed the full story. Only Holmes, myself, Inspector Lestrade, and Miss Ridley understood the delicate lattice of memory, guilt, and deduction that had brought a man of influence to his knees. It was not yet 7 when I found Holmes seated at our breakfast table, the Morning Chronicle folded beside his untouched eggs. He had not shaved, and the embers in the hearth suggested he had been up since dawn, perhaps all night. "You've not slept," I said, sitting across from him. "I seldom do, Watson, when my mind is occupied by the residue of resolution." He poured himself a cup of coffee but did not drink it. "There is something about a solved case," he continued, "that leaves a certain flatness, like a stage after the curtain has fallen. The mystery dissipates and the rest is merely paperwork and consequence." "Justice has been served," I said firmly. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Has it?" I blinked. "Bradmore has been arrested. Mrs. Halsey's testimony is signed and sworn. Miss Ridley is safe. The case is closed." He tapped a finger against the side of his cup. "But what of Annabel Clark?" The name hung in the air like a suspended breath. "She vanished," I said, 17 years ago. "Indeed, but disappearances leave footprints, and I do not believe Bradmore acted alone in silencing her." Holmes rose and walked to the window, parting the curtain slightly. "Think, Watson. Clark wrote a letter, a dangerous one. She hid it in the wall, clearly in fear, but she never posted it. Why? Perhaps she planned to. Perhaps she tried, and then nothing. You believe someone intercepted her? I believe someone disposed of her." He turned back to me. "Bradmore would not have risked that himself, not in a household where he was only a guest. No, someone close, someone trusted by Lady Eugenia, someone who stayed behind after the murder and helped tidy the aftermath." A silence passed between us. "Then we're not done." Holmes nodded. "Not yet." We returned to Lidford Vale that same afternoon, unannounced and unheralded. Rain fell in a fine mist, cloaking the village in a perpetual dampness that suited our purpose. Discretion. At the inn, Holmes spoke briefly to the keeper, then to the clerk at the parish hall. Neither offered much new until Holmes produced a list he had compiled on the train. The surviving members of the Crowthorne household staff. "Most have left the village," the clerk said. "Only 2 I know still reside in the area. The former groundskeeper, Benjamin Hask, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Adelaide Quinn. She keeps to herself these days. Lives in a cottage near the old quarry." "Quinn," Holmes repeated. "She was in charge when Lady Eugenia died?" "Indeed. She'd been with the family for over 20 years. Holmes' expression did not change, but I knew what he was thinking. Loyalty breeds silence, and sometimes complicity. Mrs. Quinn's cottage was as neat as a military barracks. The garden was orderly, the gate free of rust, the path swept clean despite the weather. Holmes knocked gently. The woman who answered was stout, sharp-eyed, and dressed in widow's black, though there was no mourning band. She regarded us without surprise. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "I thought it might be you." He inclined his head. "You expected me?" "After yesterday's news, half the village is gossiping about it. Of course I expected someone to come sniffing around." She stepped aside and gestured us in. Her front room was plain, but well kept. Tea had already been laid as if she'd prepared for visitors. Holmes sat, not touching this cup she offered. "Mrs. Quinn," he began, "you were the head of household staff at Crowthorne House during the time of Lady Eugenia's death." You were also present when Annabel Clark disappeared." "I was," she said, "and I remember it all very clearly." Her tone was not defensive, merely resigned. "I told her not to speak," she continued. "Told her to keep her head down and let things lie, but she didn't listen. Foolish girl." "What happened to her?" Holmes asked softly. Mrs. Quinn looked into her tea. "She tried to send the letter. That same night, I found her in the servants' corridor, coat on, trembling. She said she was going to post it to Mr. Ridley. She said she couldn't live with herself. And I stopped her. I begged her to wait, to think it through. I told her it wasn't her burden, that the authorities wouldn't believe a maid's word against a gentleman's. And she listened, only for a moment. Then she ran out into the rain." She paused, her voice trembling now. "She never came back. They found her body 3 days later in the quarry pond. Said she slipped on the rocks. Drowned." Holmes was silent. "But she didn't slip, did she?" I asked. Mrs. Quinn's eyes filled with tears. "No," she whispered. "I believe she was followed. Someone saw her leave the house. Maybe even overheard us talking. She was terrified and the ground was slick, but—" She shook her head. "She didn't fall. She was pushed." Holmes leaned forward. "Who else knew she had seen Bradmore poison the tonic?" "I didn't tell anyone, but Ivy might have. She and Annabel were close. Maybe too close. You must understand, Mr. Holmes. None of us had power. Bradmore was untouchable. When Lady Eugenia died, I thought maybe it was the heart. I wanted to believe it, but deep down, I knew." "You covered for him," Holmes said flatly. "I kept order," she replied. "The lady was gone. The staff were frightened. I did what I could to protect the rest." Holmes stood. "And in doing so, you allowed a murderer to ascend to Parliament." Mrs. Quinn said nothing, but I could see the shame written deep in her face, etched in the lines of long, silent years. Holmes turned to the door. "Come, Watson. We are done here." That evening, Holmes made a full report to Lestrade. He provided the parish record of Annabel Clark's death, Mrs. Quinn's testimony, and several inconsistencies in the original coroner's report that now seemed glaring in light of the new evidence. Within days, Scotland Yard reopened the Clark case. The official ruling of accidental death was overturned. Though no formal charges could be brought, no surviving witnesses, no direct evidence, Bradmore's role was cemented by implication. He was to stand trial not only for the murder of Lady Eugenia, but as a suspect in Clark's suspicious demise. Holmes declined to attend the pre-trial hearings. "The theatre of justice does not interest me," he said one evening a week after our return. "I prefer the mechanics of truth." Miss Ridley, however, paid us a visit. She entered our sitting room with a gentle smile, a heavy coat over her arm, and something faintly new in her expression, peace or something near it. "I've decided to leave London," she said. "There's a teaching position in Lyon. I think I shall take it." Holmes nodded. "You will be among books, I imagine. Memory has always found its kin there." She smiled. "Yes, but more than that. I think I would like to teach children to forget, or at least not to be burdened by remembering everything. Sometimes, Mr. Holmes, too much memory can be as terrible as too little." "Quite so," he murmured. "But it was your memory that brought justice." She turned to go, but paused at the door. "Thank you both for believing me." After she left, Holmes stood by the fire, pipe in hand, watching the smoke curl and fade. "Curious thing," he said at last. "What is? The past. No matter how deeply buried, it seems to find a way to breathe again." I said nothing. Outside, the fog was thick. But in our small room, the truth, for once, stood clear and still. The fog lingered into the following morning, casting Baker Street in a pale, spectral light. Outside, the clatter of horses' hooves and the cries of newsboys faded into a grey murmur, as if London itself were holding its breath. Inside our sitting room, Holmes stood at the window, smoking his pipe with uncharacteristic languor. "Strange," he said at last, "how silence lingers after a storm. One would expect thunder. Instead, we are left with mist." I looked up from the newspaper. The headlines have moved on. A foreign scandal in Brussels. A fire on Fleet Street. The public has a short memory. "Unlike Miss Ridley," Holmes replied dryly. He turned from the window. "Tell me, Watson, do you truly believe it's over?" I hesitated. "Bradmore awaits trial. The deaths of Lady Eugenia and Annabel Clark are no longer hidden. Miss Ridley is safe. What remains?" Holmes tapped the ash from his pipe and reached for his files. "There is a detail," he said, thumbing through papers. "A single splinter beneath the nail. A man does not orchestrate a murder, ascend to power, and maintain silence for 17 years without help. I am not convinced we have found all his accomplices." "You think someone else was involved beyond Mrs. Quinn and the household staff?" "Precisely. Someone who existed not in the periphery, but in the shadows. The servant who disposes of the glass is important, yes, but what of the man who supplied the poison? Who advised Bradmore on dosage? Arsenic is not taken from a country apothecary without leaving a trace." I leaned forward. "Do you think he had help from within his own circle? A fellow conspirator?" Holmes's brow furrowed. "Possibly. Or perhaps something more subtle. An enabler. Someone who knew and kept silent for profit or protection." He pulled out a slender, sealed envelope from the file. "This," he said, handing it to me, "arrived this morning. No return address." I opened it. Inside was a single sheet, typed in crisp black letters. "Mr. Holmes, you've removed the rotten branch, but not the root. Look to the family physician, not the one who signed the death, but the one who recommended tonics." "A friend," I looked up sharply. "Another doctor?" Holmes nodded. "Doctor. Horace Dillingham certified the death. But who prescribed the tonic in the first place?" He rose abruptly, the fire rekindled in his eyes. "Come, Watson, we're not quite finished with Lidford Vale, after all." We returned to the village with as little ceremony as before, arriving just after noon on a wet and wind-swept day. The innkeeper greeted us with a knowing look and a pot of tea. "You'll be asking after old matters again, I expect," he said, not unkindly. "Just one more," Holmes replied. "Tell me, before Dr. Dillingham was the Crowthorne family physician, was there another?" The innkeeper scratched his head. "Aye, that would be Dr. Edwin Moorcroft, retired now, lives on the edge of town up near Shepherd's Rise." Holmes's expression hardened. "Did he leave his practice of his own accord?" "Not exactly. There was some scandal years back. Nothing official, mind. But folks say he left town for a while, came back quiet and smaller somehow, never married. Keeps to himself." "Thank you," Holmes said, already standing. "We'll pay him a visit." Dr. Moorcroft's home stood at the edge of a copse of trees, a small red brick cottage with sagging eaves and moss on the path. A low garden wall, crumbling in places, encircled the house like a protective arm. Holmes knocked. No answer. He knocked again, louder. At last, the door opened. The man who stood before us was gaunt and pale, with watery eyes and a face lined by years of caution. His dressing gown was frayed at the sleeves. He looked from Holmes to me, then back again. "Whatever you're selling, I've no use for it." "We're not salesmen, Doctor." "Moorcroft," Holmes said. "We've come about Lady Eugenia Crowthorne." At the name, Moorcroft stiffened. His hand fell from the door and he stared at Holmes with thinly veiled alarm. "I don't speak of that." Holmes stepped closer. "But you will, because the past has found its voice, and it is not kind to those who stay silent." Moorcroft looked as though he might shut the door, but something in Holmes's expression, cold, direct, final, stopped him. He opened it fully and gestured us in. The house smelled of old paper and neglect. Books lay in heaps across the furniture. Holmes declined a seat and remained standing, tall and motionless as a figure carved from stone. Moorcroft poured himself a trembling glass of brandy. "I suppose you want to know what I knew." "I want to know what you did," Holmes corrected. "You prescribed Lady Eugenia's tonic?" "I did." "Did you know it was being tampered with?" Moorcroft didn't answer. Instead, he looked at his glass. "I was paid to keep quiet. Nothing more." "By Bradmore?" "No," he said. "By Lord Crowthorne." Holmes's brows rose. "Her husband." Moorcroft nodded. "He came to me month before her death. Said his wife was troubled, nervous, erratic. He asked for a tonic to help her sleep. I complied. It was nothing special. Bitters, valerian, a few herbs." "And did you later learn that Bradmore had access to it?" "Not directly, but I saw them together. Too often. Bradmore was no mere guest. He had influence, and when Lady Eugenia died, I suspected. Of course I did, but I had already taken money. I couldn't accuse without implicating myself." He drained the brandy and slumped in his chair. "Crowthorne died within the year. Bradmore returned to London. I remained here, reduced, shamed. I thought the matter buried." Holmes stepped forward. "You will provide a statement." Moorcroft laughed bitterly. "To what end?" "No one would believe me." "On the contrary," Holmes said. "Your admission, added to the rest, paints a damning picture. You may still salvage a shred of honor. If not for Lady Eugenia, then for Annabel Clark." Moorcroft flinched. "I didn't know about the girl." "But you know now," I said. He nodded, slowly. "I'll write what I can." By the time we returned to London, Lestrade had already begun preparing additional charges. Moorcroft's statement, though late, was coherent and detailed, sufficient to establish that Bradmore's manipulation of the tonic had been facilitated by his access and enabled by silence. Holmes refused to deliver the papers himself. Instead, he returned to Baker Street and spent the evening in contemplation, his violin resting untouched in its case. After supper, I asked him, "Do you think it will change anything?" He looked up. "Number, but it may prevent it from happening again. A man like Bradmore counts on indifference, on time-erasing crime. We have, for once, denied him both." There was a knock at the door. I rose to answer it. Miss Ridley stepped inside, her coat damp from the evening air. She smiled at Holmes, then turned to me. "I thought I should tell you in person," she said. "They've offered me a new post. In Alexandria. I leave in a fortnight." "Egypt?" I said, surprised. "Quite far. That's the idea. Somewhere with sun and sand and silence." Holmes offered her a rare smile. "And fewer ghosts." She nodded. "I've remembered enough to last a lifetime. I'd like, just once, to forget the sound of a locked door behind me." We wished her well, and as the door closed, behind her, I turned to Holmes. "You were right, you know. Memory may fade, but the truth, eventually, surfaces." Holmes did not reply, but I saw it in his expression, a flicker of satisfaction, dimmed by the knowledge that even victory cannot undo what time and treachery have wrought. But sometimes, just sometimes, it can make them visible. And for Sherlock Holmes, that was enough. The trial of Sir Felix Bradmore opened to a packed gallery at the Central Criminal Court, better known as the Old Bailey. Despite Holmes's distaste for public spectacle, even he conceded that the proceedings merited observation, if not for the law's performance, then for the behavior of the accused. We attended the second day of the trial, seated behind the barristers and public officials, just close enough to observe Bradmore without drawing the attention of the eager journalists peppered throughout the gallery. Holmes sat rigidly, hands clasped together in a steeple before his lips, eyes fixed upon the accused with the intensity of a surgeon examining a cadaver. Bradmore himself appeared composed, perhaps too composed. He wore the manner of a man who still believed he might talk his way out of any cell, charm his way through any verdict. His hair was impeccably combed, his cuffs stiff with starch, his mouth pulled into a faint half-smile when addressed by the prosecution. But I, who had watched men lie from witness boxes before, saw the truth in his hands. They were never still. The prosecution opened with the facts. Lady Eugenia Crowthorne, dead under suspicious circumstances in 1878, the subsequent disappearance of Annabel Clark, the recent revelations by Clara Ridley, and the confession of Ivy Halsey. Each detail was presented with clinical precision. Holmes had ensured it. The Crown's barrister, a wiry man named Havisham, wielded the evidence like a scalpel, careful never to overstate what could be simply shown. When Mrs. Halsey took the stand, I felt a stir ripple through the court. She looked older than I remembered her, but no less resolute. She spoke clearly, simply, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she described the night Annabel vanished and the moment she realized the house had turned deadly. She was afraid, Mrs. Halsey said, not for herself, but for what would happen if she kept quiet, and I was afraid to do anything but. Her testimony was damning, but what followed gripped the court even more. Dr. Edwin Moorcroft, frail but coherent, stood under oath and admitted his part. The prescription of the original tonic, the acceptance of hush money, the suspicions he had swallowed in exchange for comfort. His voice quivered at times, but not once did he waver. I believed, he said, that my silence would protect me. It did. For a while. But the weight of it never left. When the prosecution introduced the letter from Annabel Clark, retrieved from the panel behind the mantel at Crowthorne House, there was an audible hush. Though the document had aged and the ink had faded, its words were unmistakable. Holmes had insisted it be read aloud. Mr. Bradmore placed something in her ladyship's tonic. I know what I saw. If anything happens to her, please tell Mr. Ridley the truth. Holmes leaned toward me during the reading. Nothing compels a jury quite like the dead speaking from beyond the grave. Then came Clara Ridley. She stood tall in the witness box, composed, precise, her voice as crisp as her recollections. When asked to recount the memory that had haunted her into the present, she delivered the phrase with such clarity that even the judge seemed moved. The arsenic will pass for tonic. She'll be dead by morning, and no one will think to question it. When the defense rose to cross-examine her, their tone shifted from courteous to probing. They suggested that memories from childhood were unreliable, that trauma could invent dialogue, that dreams sometimes masqueraded as truths. But Clara remained unshaken. I remember every word, she said calmly. I've always remembered them. I simply did not understand them until now. The defense attempted to sow doubt, implying her condition, a condition Holmes had earlier described in court as hyperthymesia, was unnatural, perhaps unstable. Holmes had anticipated this. He had arranged for a neurologist from King's College to testify to the legitimacy of her memory. The expert left no ambiguity. Clara Ridley's recall was both rare and real. When Sir Felix himself was called to testify, the room bristled. He declined to take the stand. It was his legal right, but the silence spoke volumes. The court adjourned late that day, and Holmes and I returned to Baker Street beneath a bruised evening sky. A fine rain had begun to fall again, as if the city sought to wash itself clean of the rot it had unearthed. In our sitting room, Holmes lit a match and stared into the fireplace as flames caught the kindling. "He will be convicted," he said finally, "but that is only justice for one death. There are others who remain buried, not just in graveyards, but in memory." "You mean Annabel Clark?" "Yes. and perhaps others we shall never know. A man like Bradmore is rarely content with a single deception. His career was built on them, lies layered atop lies, and always disguised as virtue. Holmes reached for a file from the mantel and opened it. I requested a report from the Treasury. It seems Bradmore's estate holdings were used to support two quiet trusts, both off the record. One in the name of a Mrs. Jane Ellis, a supposed housekeeper who received quarterly payments. The other. He paused. Yes, I prompted. The other was for the child of a former maid at Crowthorne House. I blinked. Annabel. Holmes nodded. Possibly. Or someone else he feared might speak. We may never know. But the truth, Watson, is like dry tinder. Single spark, and it burns through everything, no matter how long it's been hidden. There was a knock at the door. Lestrade entered, hat in hand. He's done for, he announced without ceremony. Jury only took 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. He'll hang, unless the Home Office wants to save face and send him to Dartmoor for life. Holmes said nothing. Lestrade shifted uncomfortably. Look, Holmes, I know you don't care for trials, but this one mattered. You did the Yard proud, though God knows you'll never let us forget it. Holmes smiled faintly. Pride is for institutions, Lestrade. I prefer facts. As the inspector departed, I looked once more to Holmes. His expression was unreadable. Will you rest now? I asked. With the case closed? He turned to the window, the gas lamps of Baker Street glowing through the haze. Rest is for the content, Watson, he said softly, but satisfaction that I will permit myself. He sat once more, the fire warming his hands, and reached for his violin at last. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but inside, the quiet melody of Holmes's bow across strings marked an ending, not triumphant, but earned. The woman who remembered too much had told her truth, and at last, the world had listened. The days following the verdict passed in an oddly subdued fashion, as if London itself had paused to exhale. The papers, having wrung every sensational detail from the Bradmore case, turned their attention elsewhere, first to a riot in Marseille, then to a jewel theft in Vienna. But within the walls of 221B Baker Street, the case refused to loosen its grip. Holmes moved with restless purpose. He slept little, and even when seated, his hands fidgeted, turning envelopes over, tapping a rhythm on the arms of his chair, or sketching indecipherable diagrams on scraps of paper. I recognized the signs at once. The case had ended, but something in it had not released him. One evening, as I returned from the chemist, I found him at the window, staring down at Baker Street as though waiting for something, or someone. Still no peace? I asked, removing my coat. Holmes didn't move. The trial concluded, the man convicted, and yet the edges fray. I poured myself a drink. You don't believe justice was served? Oh, justice was served, Watson, but not in full. There's a difference between a solved case and a resolved one. The former is the work of courts, the latter is the business of conscience. I sat across from him, watching as he turned over a letter on the sill. I recognized the seal. It was from Clara Ridley, posted from Marseille. She's en route to Alexandria, he said. She writes with thanks, and with a final question. He handed me the letter. It was brief. Mr. Holmes, you spoke once of a root beneath the crime, a hidden cause beyond Bradmore's ambition. I find myself wondering, did you ever find it? Was there more to Lady Eugenia's death than what we uncovered? With enduring gratitude, Clara Ridley, I looked up. And? Was there? Holmes resumed his seat. Possibly. There remains a name that never surfaced, one that should have. He gestured toward a stack of documents on the side table. After the trial, I requested access to Lord Crowthorne's will, filed the year before Lady Eugenia's death. I thought it a simple curiosity, But there, buried in a codicil, is the mention of a trust set aside for a person named L.B., to be activated only upon Lady Eugenia's death. L.B.? Precisely. No further detail. No age, no gender, no location. But the amount, substantial. £5,000. I frowned. That suggests motive. And motive, Holmes said, requires attention. He rose and walked to the shelf where his commonplace books rested. From one he withdrew a slim ledger filled with notes and clippings. I had nearly overlooked a letter from a former maid, one not involved in the main household affairs. She had written to a cousin, who later submitted the letter to the Manchester Courier after the Bradmore story broke. He flipped open the book and read, "The mistress never spoke of her sister, but I once overheard the lady mention someone named Louisa, hidden away in a sanatorium. Something to do with nerves and a scandal. Mr. Bradmore heard it too, I think. He made a remark after, about loose threads needing cutting." "Louisa," I echoed. "L.B." "Exactly," Holmes said. "And what do we know of Lady Eugenia? She married young, was wealthy in her own right, and fiercely protective of her family name. A hidden sister would explain much, especially if there were inheritance at stake. Imagine if Bradmore knew that Lady Eugenia was diverting funds to a relative who, if discovered, might undermine both her social standing and his ambitions. And so he removes her." Holmes nodded. "It's a theory, but no more than that, until now." He crossed the room again and opened a large map of London. "There's only one institution from that period known to house discreet patients of means with mental afflictions, and only one with a ward labelled Blenheim Wing, where wealthy female patients were kept from the public eye." "St. Christopher's," I said. "Out by Ealing." Holmes smiled. "You do pay attention." The next morning, we journeyed west by cab, the streets of London slowly giving way to quieter lanes and the scent of distant meadows. St. Christopher's loomed large, an austere grey building nestled behind tall hedges and wrought iron gates. Inside, the matron greeted us with a cautious eye. Holmes presented a forged letter of inquiry, carefully drafted to appear as though he were researching a genealogy case for a distant relative. The matron, flattered by the official seal and Holmes's icy charm, led us through the long corridors lined with quiet patients and soft-footed nurses. "We keep extensive records," she explained. "Many of our residents have no visitors. They become part of the walls, I suppose." We were shown to the records room, a narrow alcove crowded with ledgers. Holmes quickly scanned the volumes marked with the year 1878. Within minutes, he found it. "Louisa Bennet," he murmured. "Admitted March 1877. Diagnosis, hysteria, melancholia, and delusional episodes. Referred by guardian, Lady Eugenia Crowthorne." He looked up. "There's your L.B., Watson." I read over his shoulder. "Discharged?" "No," Holmes said grimly. "Not discharged. Deceased. November 1878. Same month Eugenia died." We looked at each other. "Two deaths," I said. "Same family. Same month." Holmes closed the ledger slowly. Bradmore eliminated both. The sister in secret, the wife in society. The trust was his target. With Eugenia gone and no one to claim the funds, the codicil would be void, and the inheritance would default to the estate's trustee. "Bradmore," I said. Holmes nodded. "An elegant cruelty." He returned the ledger to the shelf. No fanfare, no scandal, just paper and poison. That evening, as we returned to Baker Street, Holmes was quieter than usual. He stood at the window again, not watching the street but something beyond it, lost in a place only he could see. "Will you tell Miss Ridley?" I asked. "In time," he replied. "Let her begin her new life first. What remains here, this final truth, would only burden her." He turned away from the window. "But I will record it, For the record, for the conscience, because history has a way of repeating what it forgets. I watched him take up his pen, as he had so many times before, and begin to write, not as a man solving a case, but as one laying it to rest. Louisa Bennet, unmarked, unremembered. Sister to the slain, pawn to the ambitious, her life erased in ink and silence, but no longer. He signed it with a flourish, folded the paper, and placed it with the others, his private record of truth. Justice, he said, is not always blind. Sometimes it merely blinks, then waits to see who else is watching. We sat in silence, the fire crackling softly beside us. The case was closed, but the story, like all truths, remained. The final days of November arrived wrapped in fog and silence. A cold wind swept down Baker Street, rattling window panes and curling around chimneys as if carrying with it the last breath of autumn. The Brad Moore affair had faded from public discourse, displaced by more immediate concerns. A bank collapse in Birmingham, a scandal involving a Hungarian countess, and, as Holmes had so often predicted, the numbing return of everyday noise. And yet, within the walls of 221B, the echoes of the case had not entirely vanished. Holmes remained curiously subdued, though not withdrawn. His movements were purposeful, but devoid of his usual flourishes. He read less than usual, smoked more, and took to playing his violin not in bold arpeggios, but quiet, meditative strains. Each night I heard those haunting notes drift up the stairwell like echoes of things unsaid. On the evening of December 1st, I returned to our lodgings to find Holmes standing beside the hearth, an open envelope in hand and a faint smile ghosting across his lips. "It is a letter," he said without looking up, "from Miss Ridley." I set my umbrella in the stand. "From Alexandria?" "Yes. She writes of sunlit mornings, the scent of papyrus, and students more curious than obedient. She is well. I'm glad to hear it." Holmes handed me the letter and turned back toward the window. I read, "Mr. Holmes, I find myself surrounded by a people who do not believe in ghosts, but who honor memory with great reverence. It strikes me that, had I grown up here, perhaps I would not have feared mine so much. I'm learning to live with remembrance rather than under it. Thank you for that. Yours, gratefully, Clara Ridley." I folded the paper slowly, allowing the warmth of her words to settle. "You helped her," I said. "You gave her back her future." Holmes gave a short, almost imperceptible shrug. She was the only person in that house 17 years ago who did not silence herself. She merely didn't understand what she had heard. Memory is not a gift, Watson, not unless one knows how to bear it. He turned to the fire and poked the coals. "Do you know what disturbs me still?" he asked suddenly. I waited. Not Bradmore, not even the injustice. It is the notion that if Clara Ridley had never passed that man in a restaurant, if her memory had not stirred at that exact moment, then none of it would have come to light. A murderer would remain honored, a young maid forgotten, a sister erased. The entire sequence hinged upon a single chance encounter. "You call it chance," I said, "but perhaps it was inevitability." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "You've been spending too much time with poetry." "Perhaps. But consider, Clara remembered because someone had to. If not her, then someone else. It was only a matter of time." Holmes gave a non-committal grunt, but didn't argue. That night, we sat in the dim glow of gaslight, each with our own thoughts. For once, no client knocked at the door. No urgent telegram arrived, and Holmes made no mention of the stack of clippings he usually poured through, searching for mysteries too small or strange for Scotland Yard to notice. But late, very late, I heard him rise. His footsteps moved softly to the desk, and after a pause, the quiet scratch of his pen began. The next morning I found the pages laid neatly on the table, his handwriting clean and measured. Case summary: the woman who remembered. Too much in this case. Memory proved to be both the weapon and the shield. A murder long buried was unearthed not by science, nor by confession, but by an echo, preserved in the mind of a girl who once hid behind a curtain and heard something she was not meant to hear. The chain of logic, though fragile in its origin, proved unbreakable in the end. The case reveals the critical flaw in all great conspiracies. They rely upon forgetfulness. But forgetfulness is not universal. In every generation, there will be someone who remembers too much, someone who notices what others discard. And to them, the truth clings like dust to velvet, waiting always to be shaken free. F. Bradmore, deceased. Execution carried out December 12, 10 a.m. Annabelle Clark, no known grave. Louisa Bennett, confirmed buried under pseudonym, St. Christopher's Registry amended. Clara Ridley, now employed as instructor, Cairo School for Girls. Motive: financial inheritance and political ambition. Method: poison, arsenic, administered through personal tonic. Means of exposure: eyewitness memory, corroborated by concealed testimony and forensic omission. Case closed, November 24, 1895. I stood for a long time over the paper, reading and rereading the last line. When Holmes entered the room, I said quietly, "Why do you record the victims' names in your summaries?" He paused. "Because no one else will." In the following weeks, the cold deepened. Our cases returned. Petty thefts, a curious forgery, a young woman convinced her dog was being trained to kill by her lodger, but none with the weight or reach of the Bradmore affair. And then, on Christmas Eve, we received a parcel. It arrived with no name, but the wax seal was unmistakable, red with the faint impression of a scarab. Inside was a small ivory box, within it a pressed white lotus and a card. To those who remember, from one who will never forget. Holmes held the flower between thumb and forefinger. "A symbol of rebirth," he murmured. I nodded. "Do you think she's truly at peace?" "As close as any of us ever get." He tucked the lotus into the pages of his Bradmore file, closed it gently, and returned it to the shelf. And so the case came to its final rest, not with a dramatic revelation, nor a chase through shadowed alleys, but with a single flower and a memory no longer feared. The fog returned the next morning, soft as a whisper. And somewhere beyond it, Sherlock Holmes turned to the sound of the bell on the street below, and a new knock at our door. The fog on Baker Street had lifted by New Year's morning, replaced by a brittle blue sky that shone coldly over the rooftops of London. A faint dusting of frost clung to the ironwork of the balconies, when the air held the hush of a city momentarily at peace. In the sitting room of 221B, Holmes sat at his usual post by the window, the last of the Bradmore files arrayed neatly before him like a memorial of the case now concluded. I entered with 2 cups of coffee, which Holmes accepted absently. His gaze was turned outward, toward the bright winter sky, but I could tell his thoughts remained inward, working their way through the final strands of the web we had spent weeks untangling. "There's something you haven't told me," I said as I took my seat. He glanced over, one brow raised but not surprised. "Is there?" "Yes, you closed the case. Bradmore is dead. Miss Ridley is safe. And yet, there's a note in your eye that speaks of something unresolved." Holmes leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "You know me too well, Watson." He paused, then said quietly, "I have been thinking of Louisa Bennett, the sister. Yes, it is a strange thing, is it not, to remove a person from history without violence, only by silence. No record of birth in the public registry, no obituary, no estate claim. She was placed in St. Christopher's under a false name. Her death, too, was written off under that pseudonym. And yet she was the key to the entire affair." "How so?" Consider the codicil in Lord Crowthorne's will, the trust intended for L.B. It would have activated only upon Lady Eugenia's death. But Lord Crowthorne himself died a year earlier. If Louisa had lived, she would have inherited outright. There would have been no need for Eugenia's death to unlock the funds. Unless, Holmes finished, Bradmore convinced Lord Crowthorne to change the terms. He likely argued that Eugenia was the more stable trustee, that Louisa was unfit, and the moment Crowthorne's signature dried on the amended document, Louisa's fate was sealed. I sat in silence, struck once again by the cold brilliance of Bradmore's scheme. It had not been murder by passion, nor by fear, but by design, a sequence of removals, each justified by the next. Holmes continued. He removed the sister first, quietly, clinically. Then he turned to the wife. The method was careful, not rushed. Arsenic slipped into a tonic prescribed under the guise of benevolence, and he nearly succeeded. But why now? I asked. Why revisit this in your mind? The man is gone. The case is closed. Holmes turned to me, his expression unreadable. Because, he said slowly, we speak often of justice, but less of consequence. Bradmore's trial was justice, but the consequence of his crimes, the erasure of lives, the trauma passed down like a shadow, those do not vanish with a verdict. He rose and crossed to the fireplace, taking from the mantel a small object wrapped in muslin. He unwrapped it carefully. It was the pressed white lotus sent by Clara Ridley. I believe, he said softly, that this is the real evidence. Not a letter or a statement. This flower, a symbol of memory preserved. Yes, but also of healing, of something terrible laid to rest. I watched as he placed it gently back on the mantel. She asked in her last letter, he added, if there was more to the case than we had uncovered. And the answer, as always, is yes, there is always more. Every case we close leaves behind a residue of what might have been. But Clara, she no longer needs to carry the burden. She chose to remember and to live. Holmes returned to his seat. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, You know, Watson, I've often envied you. Me? Yes. You believe in resolution, in finality. You see an end and call it peace. I admire that. I smiled faintly. And you? I see only patterns, some completed, others fracturing in silence. But this case, this one, I think, gave me something close to contentment. Because justice was served. No, he said. Because for once, memory served justice. That is a rare and delicate reversal. He reached for his violin, its polished wood catching the morning light. The first note he drew was low and lingering, an almost elegiac sound that filled the room like breath held too long. And then, as he played, I thought of Clara Ridley standing at the edge of the Nile, the sun on her face and a memory no longer weaponized. I thought of Louisa Bennet, whose name had been restored to paper, and of Annabel Clark, remembered now, not as a servant who vanished, but as a woman whose truth endured. When the melody faded, Holmes set down the instrument and looked to me. Well, Watson, he said with a faint smile, shall we turn the page? I nodded. Until the next case. And with that, he opened the morning paper, not for headlines, but for anomalies, for inconsistencies, for the faintest tremor in the pattern of the world. Outside, London stirred. Carriages rattled over cobblestones. The city woke, and somewhere in its great maze, another truth waited to be remembered.